asked to keep the house lights up because I want to try, if at all possible, to get a little bit of an understanding of who this audience is. A group of CIOs sort of has all these prejudgments and assumptions on my part as to who you are and what your level of interest is in the subject matter, etc. So what I want to try to do, though, is I want to do a quick psychographic profile of the audience. It's something that my organization is an applied research company. What I mean by applied research is we fundamentally understand all of the elements of human productivity and human growth. How do you actually get people to be more effective at doing the stuff that you want people to do? Now, underneath that, there's a lot of diagnostics, and this is a diagnostic that is not as statistically significant as most, but we can do it pretty quickly. Take out a piece of paper in front of you, if you don't mind. Grab your pens. And one of the other things we're going to be doing in this discussion, because I really do believe that I want to try to make it more of a dialogue than actually just a talk or a speech, is I want to make this as action-oriented as possible so the paper and pencil will be relevant for a number of things, because I want you to leave here being more capable of developing the kind of relationships and relationship action plans for implementation and change management for the projects that you have in the given year and for your careers. So hopefully we'll be a little bit more action-oriented than most speakers and a little bit more engaging. But here, let's go for this for the diagnostic. So I'm going to read 4 shapes and sizes, just 4, in a sequential row that really mean nothing, but whichever one of them jumps into your mind the most, whichever one grabs your attention the most, whichever one is the forefront of your thinking, don't ask, question, or judge what that means. Just go ahead and write it down, all right? Don't ask, question, or judge. Just go ahead and go with it and write it down, and then we'll talk about it, what that means. All right, here you go. A circle, a triangle, a square, a Z. Circle, triangle, square, Z. Write one of those shapes down, please. If you can't think of one right now, that says something about you. It'd be much too embarrassing to share, so we won't go there. All right, everybody have something down? Just out of curiosity, anybody put more than one of those down on the piece of paper? Did anybody write more than one? That's good. Okay, good. Because I said only one, and that would have also talked about your personality disorders that we would talk about afterwards. So here we go. Circles, raise your hands. Oh my God. That really is shocking to me. More than 50% of the audience are circles. I say that because I would have never expected that from a group of CIOs. It's never happened, and I've been doing a lot of talks these days with many of your organizations, particularly if you're members of the Big Six and software folks, etc., to CIO audiences. Never seen more than 50%. But let me explain what that means. That means that more than 50% of you, good news, you're out-of-the-box thinkers. You embrace change. Good in the rapidly changing environment that we're going to be talking about at this event. These are individuals that are out-of-the-box thinkers, but they also are people that do embrace people, all right? Now, the thing about you is you specifically avoided anything that boxed you in, anything that made you feel claustrophobic in any way, straight edges, pointy corners, etc. You avoided. As a result, more than 50% of this audience, a particularly undisciplined group of individuals. So I don't know if if that relates to you or not, but I was just shocked, all right? Triangles, raise your hands. Ooh, good. Keep them up. Keep them up. Keep them up. Indicative of being here on a Sunday, but keep them up because anybody sitting next to a triangle, be careful. There's a whole table of them there, so that's really, really frightening. And by the way, the ones that just kept their hands up even longer after I said be careful, be even more careful, all right? Because the triangles will do anything to get to the top of an organization as quickly as possible. In this room, they're the most ruthlessly driven individuals. They will stop at nothing as a result of that ambition. But make sure that before you leave today, get their business cards, identify who they are, and for God's sake, stay on their good sides, okay? Who put a square? No, it's okay. The world needs accountants too. It's not a problem, seriously. Oh, you're so embarrassed. That's great. Good for you to be proud of that because all of you circles, what's your name, sir? Frank. All of you circles desperately need Frank, okay? These are the individuals with discipline, with rigor. They're the folks who actually bound out into the world and have process. They're the people who come to an event like this. They're the individuals that, by the way, does not mean that Frank is some weenie-dweeby guy, all right, that doesn't connect with people, that has nothing to do with a square and that old high school vernacular. But Frank will, in fact, meet people. Frank will collect business cards, but by the end of the tonight, Frank will be entering the names in a database. That's who Frank is. These 4 individuals are the only one in their entire company using their CRM system. Having started the CRM practice at Deloitte many of years ago for for our practice, I certainly know what that means. And then there's the Z's. Then there's the Z's. Now, don't raise your hands. That would, in fact, be too embarrassing for any of you, because Z's just preoccupied with booze and sex. We have yet to find any socially redeeming value for you, and if at this stage any of you are interested in changing to a Z just to make the event more fun, stand up. Go right ahead. No. But the Z's, I'm only kidding, the Z's are the nonconformists. These are the individuals, normal shapes, sizes, etc. They did it their way. Look, the reason I wanted to start with this little exercise, while it was actually something that we started researching way back at Harvard Business School when we were doing something called the service profit chain. He's very proud of his Z, aren't you? You really are. That's fantastic. What's your name, sir? Dave? Dale. Oh, Dale, this is your thing. This is great. Well, and he's the guy who hired me. Oh, great. By the way, so I would assume, I would assume that this better be a damn good event if Dale's organizing this one, all right? So you should have some fun tonight. All right. But one of the things that is important as you're thinking about what all of this just meant is this. What we're going to be talking about today is the psychology and the anatomy of productivity enhancement. We're going to be talking about the psychology and the anatomy of running business, the psychology and the mindsets and the processes of how to manage people associated with getting stuff done, increasing productivity, project management, etc. And what's important to recognize is that as much as we could do a lot of very demographic profiling, ultimately human behavior change does not boil down to demographic profiling or even functional profiling. It boils down to psychographic profiling. What I mean by that is every one of you is a very unique and interesting animal. And I say animal because that's very important. For years we have run a research institute that had a lot of PhDs, MDs, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. But it wasn't until we started adding the anthropologists and the sociologists that we really started having some breakthroughs in human behaviors in organizations. And the reason for that is because as much as we're talking about the human behavior and psychology of human behavior and behavior change, what we're really talking about is how animals, i.e. humans, change, think, behave, and interact with others. And it all goes back to about 70,000 years ago when everybody in this room was hardwired as a Homo sapien in Africa among 17 distinct tribes. So in your DNA, if you weren't in one of these tribes, think about this for a second, right? Your ancestors and the way you were created, if you weren't in a tribe, you were eaten by something. Do you understand that? And that very basic human instinct to connect, to commune, to support, to relate, is so critical to who you are. Now that said, you speed ahead 70,000 years, and unfortunately, tribes don't exist like they used to. We've spun by a bunch of years where tribes did exist, where family units ate together, and they don't anymore. Where cities and towns were actually communities. Where organizations were actually tribes. Where people cared and connected and bonded and did things with each other that were powerful and integrated, and you wouldn't let each other fail because, frankly, if you did let each other fail, the whole unit would be at risk. Unfortunately today, because of lots of reasons, whether that's technology or mobilization and others, we have really gotten down to the point when your tribal instincts are so very down to the individual and so isolated that you have become tribes of one. Now, that's when the negative stuff associated with tribal behavior kicks in, because the negative stuff associated with tribal behavior is that when you walk out into the world, it's us, our tribe, happens to just be you and them, everyone else. And you don't know how to relate in a connected manner. You make assumptions when it's us versus them. You make negative assumptions because in those 17 tribes originally when you were hardwired, if it wasn't a part of us, they were going to hurt you. They were a them. Does that make sense to you? If you understand what I'm saying, just say, I get it. So the good news is that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to suggest to everybody in this room that all you've got to do to be successful in managing the more effective relationships of your life, in effect for business success, and I'm going to make that linkage for a second, is to fall back on what your core DNA and what your human instincts want you to do anyway. Which is why when you do it, and you periodically connect with a business associate, with a team, with a partner, with a boss, you relax into a place that really feels right in your core. You know what I'm saying? One more time. I'm going to track. Tell me you get it. All right. So with all of that in mind, let me turn for a moment to some of the data. If I could go to the next slide. What we have found, and I'm going to only touch on a couple of pieces of these. How many people in this room have ever had a boss that you knew really cared about your success? Imagine for a moment what that felt like. Think about it for a second. First of all, how many of you have had that experience? A boss really cared about your success? Raise your hands. Yeah, I bet if I asked if it was your current boss, it might be a different set of hands, right? But if you ever did, then you remembered what happened, right? What are some of the things? Give me some of the attributes that you recall from having a boss that really cared about your success. And I'm going to come down for a second. So tell me a little bit more about what some of those attributes were. What happened? How'd you feel? How'd you interact? Give me some observations. Collaboration. You were more collaborative, interestingly enough. Now, by the way, were you just saying more collaborative with the boss or with the team itself? Now, isn't that an interesting observation? Because generally what happens is if you have a better relationship with the boss, what you're basically saying is that the collaboration of the team increases because chances are the boss has a similar relationship with the other individuals. In fact, when there's a greater level of intimacy between a boss and a set of associates, what happens, interestingly enough, is it actually decreases the reliance of communication only up to the boss and back to the individual. Most organizations are walking around like maypoles, you know what I mean? Boss is in the middle, and we're all sort of walking around with the streamers around the maypole. 70% of the information flows, think about your own teams and your own communications, 70% of the information flows from the individual up to the boss, back down to the individual, the boss, to the individual. 30% of the information, by the way, these are well-performing teams, 30% of the information goes peer-to-peer, right? And usually that peer-to-peer component is only if something is overlapping or broken or there's a need to have that peer-to-peer communication. Otherwise, 70% goes up to the boss. Is this all making sense? Right. In the highest performing teams that we studied over about the last 8 years, 1,000 of the highest performing teams, whether those be basketball teams, soccer teams in Europe, high-performing business teams like Jamie Dimon's team from JP Morgan and a number of others. In the highest performing teams that we studied, what we found was that the communication among the most successful team, only 30% of the communication went up to the boss. 70% of the communication and, by the way, the accountability, meaning somebody saying you're out of base, you should be doing something differently. That level of peer-to-peer accountability was 70% of the team dynamic. Now imagine for a moment yourself, if you were able to take your own teams and transform your teams as CIOs to have 70% of the interaction being peer-to-peer, 70% of the action being peer-to-peer and even outside of your team to their key users, and not having to be the individual that has all of the decisions coming up to you as an individual. First of all, it would be off your shoulders to a great extent, but more importantly, imagine the productivity enhancement if the team itself took that responsibility. Does that make sense to you? All right, next point. So again, tell me more about that. What else happened when that boss was highly connected to you as an individual? What else do you remember? What's that? Empathy. But we all do stuff that gets in our way. It is empathy, in fact, that allows us to understand and forgive some of those things, as opposed to dialing up the behavior, getting all pissed off about it, and letting yourself chew up on that particular issue and not be willing to really understand another person's point of view. So you have more empathy. What else do you have when you had that relationship in the past? Maybe that was a dream team of some sort in the past. What else do you have? What? You had higher degrees of trust. What else? Common goals. That's it. Higher degrees of risk-taking. Yes, you did. And with that, higher degrees of innovation. Because what happens, let me just stay on this for a second. Imagine being in a team where you can say stupid stuff, right? That only happens if you have enough social comfort. By the way, you guys have the best view here, okay? So I apologize in advance. The ability to walk into a room and be able to shoot from the gut and say stupid stuff, right, is the ability to innovate. If your people can't take social risk with each other, if they're so worried about what they're going to say, if they're so worried about the ramifications, if they have to be right all the time, They're not going to take the kind of social risks that will actually, maybe that one great idea that could radically reduce the cycle time of a new project introduction. Or maybe that radical pink elephant that's been dancing around the damn room that everybody knows is true in a project that you're trying to shove through, and yet the user has no interest in it. I don't know if any of you has any empathy for what I'm talking about. And nobody says anything because they don't feel the social comfort and familiarity. They can't take the risk. So from a risk-taking perspective, one of the things that we did with JP Morgan and a number of the other banks is we interviewed a lot of the banks right at the end of the financial crisis and asked the question, do you remember the conversation that happened when you went down the rat hole, right, and started investing in mortgage-backed securities that were so risky that you shouldn't have been investing in the first place? Do you remember that conversation? Everybody remembered it. It was like one of these slow-motion train wrecks that they all remember and they'll never forget. And at JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon's group, the whole conversation took 45 minutes and they decided not to go there. This was a time when they were getting their butts kicked by Wall Street for not going there. By the way, is Guy here, the CIO at Jamie Dimon's group? Guy? Okay, so he's not here in the room. But you could ask him, and he'll attest to it. He remembers this conversation. When you bound into the room there, somebody had this great proposal. We should do it. We're getting killed on Wall Street because we're not keeping up with the instruments that everybody else is keeping up to. There's profits on the table we're not taking. And what should we do? A young guy on the team said, I don't get it. Took a young guy on the team to say, listen, I'm not saying it's wrong or bad. I literally just can't figure it out. It doesn't make sense to me. One of the old guys said, kid, if it doesn't make sense to you, it's too good to be true. And they basically stopped after a little bit of yelling and screaming. After about 45 minutes, they decided not to go there. You go to another bank, I'm not going to name it, but they're no longer in existence. And we found 3 other banks that were exactly the same thing. In that same room, there were people that didn't get it. They didn't say anything because they were afraid of looking stupid, and the ramifications of looking stupid were too high. Right? Other individuals in that same room, and now, by the way, translate this to your own systems implementations. How many times would you want to have risks sitting on the table in people's guts and have them not express them? And I promise you it's happening. How many of you have ever been in a room, in a meeting that's critical to the success of one of your projects, and you only find out, like a period of time later, that people withheld their tongue for fear of their own taking of risk in the room? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. How many of you are in rooms every day where people leave the room and that's when the real conversation happens? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, again, the giggling. There we go. Good. And the point is, shame on you if you're leading that room. Shame on you if you're leading that room. If this is your project, and I don't care if the organization as a whole is anathema to candor and anathema to risk-taking, but if you're leading the project and you can't facilitate enough safety in that room to understand what's going to bite you in the butt or what's going to elongate implementation cycle time, then shame on you as a leader of a project that can't cut through that culture. Right? I'm sorry to be so crass about it, but you understand what I'm saying? Tell me you get it. Right? That's your responsibilities, and it's not just being able to do a great Gantt chart anymore, folks. We, as change leaders, which is why what you hope to be in order to make the big bucks, in order to deserve to sit at the executive table, in order to drive the strategies of organizations into the future, are going to need to drive the culture change associated with the strategies that you're going to be suggesting. I'm not even talking about the onboarding of people. I'm just talking about driving the successful implementation without radical risk associated with it, right? I could talk a lot more about what some of those teams look like and some of the things that happen associated with those teams. But in short, I think I want to just sort of punctuate with the fact that in the research that we've been able to do of the highest performing teams, the #1 predictor of a high-performing team. Now, there's an observable behavior which we're going to talk about, which is candor and accountability. Candor and accountability are the 2 highest predictive elements of a great performing team. Candor and accountability. And that's, by the way, not accountability up to the leader, but accountability peer-to-peer. High degrees of peer-to-peer accountability, 70% of it going this way, not up and down, and high degrees of candor, truth-telling, wrestling, sometimes even yelling respectfully because people care so much about not letting the team fail, right? Truth-telling and pulling out all the pink elements. Those are the 2. But I'll tell you what happens is that the only way you get, let's go to the, I'll come back to some other stuff. The only way you get to that level of candor and accountability is to have a foundation of enough social comfort and safety to be able to be successful. You've got to build the relationships underneath the risk-taking, underneath the innovation, underneath the change management. If I were to say to you that I need all of you to 2x, 2 times the success of your upcoming year relative to project management skills, I want you to either half the cycle time, half the budgets, double the results in performance. If I wanted you to make radical performance improvement in the coming year, would you do that through better testing? Would you do that through better, user identification of needs and requirements? Would you do that by better vendor selection? Are you going to do that by better budgeting? Where is the fuzzy amorphous black hole of potential productivity and enhancement exist? Where does that exist today? Anybody have an idea? It's in the people. It's in the people. And you don't go there. And the reason you don't go there is because you haven't been given enough of a formula to go there. It seems too squishy to even deal with. The first reason you don't go there is because you don't believe that there is a potential roadmap for improvement in the people area. I just was talking to a massive acquisition, the CEO of a massive acquisition that was going down, and I'm talking about like multiple billions of dollars acquisition. And I was talking to the head of HR and the CEO. And the two of them were battling it out, and I was brought in to try to facilitate this a little bit because of all the money that was applied to requirements and merger and figuring out how much cost would be taken out of the two organizations and how many millions and millions of dollars of McKinsey budgeting that was there and Deloitte budgeting and all of those things. All that was being done, that the head of HR had put what seemed to be now to me a paltry $200,000 budget together for cultural integration and human enhancement of the two firms coming together, and it was the first thing that was cut. Now, by this, does this surprise you? Does it radically surprise you? No, it probably shouldn't, because most of us has been affiliated with enough change initiatives to know that that's not where we go. And that was the thing that used to piss me off the most, that this was happening. And that's why we launched our firm 7 years ago. That's why we launched our research institute, because I needed to begin to elevate the quantification and the rigor associated with something that used to just be fuzzy, weird stuff. And by the way, I've gone through this myself, because as a chief marketing officer, we were also in a position 15 years ago before the title even existed, 20 years ago before the title existed, where it was just shut up and advertise this, you know? And then all of a sudden along the way, if we were really going to step up and get the credibility at the executive table, and many of your peers who are CMOs still don't deserve that credibility. But if we were going to get it as a function, it had to do with speaking the executive's language of shareholder value. And so my enticement and interest here was being able to speak the language of shareholder value for you associated with the change management components of it. Now, the first thing, I want to go back a little bit to a couple of slides here. Very quickly, what we study innovation and its impact on relationships, as I've just discussed. We study change management and how fundamentally change management, I'll boil it down by the end of our conversation and make change management the easiest thing you've ever thought of. Every initiative you have to execute, there are 25 people that are critical to the success of that initiative, that if you onboard those 25 people more effectively, if you get them to be ambassadors of whatever initiative it is that you're rolling out, those 25 individuals will fundamentally drive the change that you need to change. Change management done. There are a core few individuals that are the key cascaders of all change initiatives, and if you do effective relationship action planning around your initiatives, which is a lot easier than to think about this whole change management thing that's been in existence since the days that Michael Hammer launched re-engineering. Just who are the 25 most important people to the success of this initiative? How am I going to get them to be ambassadors? That's the question you should be asking yourself. Does that make more sense than the fuzzy space, just as a simple starting point? Tell me you get it. Or not. Okay. High impact teams. Of the 55 highest performing teams, the number one predictor of a great team was deep social bonds. Deep social bonds. That's it, the number one predictor, because with those deep social bonds, you can have empathy and forgive, and you project to the future in terms of being able to give a damn about each other enough to succeed. Those are some of the metrics that we've actually quantified underneath them. The other thing is to recognize that Gallup has proven, and this was something study that they did that we didn't, that of, how many of you in this room track employee engagement scores? Raise your hands if you know you do that. Do you realize that question 10, if you're using the Gallup survey, the number one predictor of high employee engagement scores is question number 10. Do you have a friend in the workplace? If you have a friend at work, you actually have a 30% higher level of employee engagement, which translates into 17% higher productivity. If in fact that friend is your boss, you add another 50% to the numbers. But intuitively, does this make sense to you? When you had a boss that was like that, you bound out of bed with more of a spring in your step. You worked later and you didn't resent it. You did things on the weekends and thought that that was a part of the cause for the group mission because something mattered. That's the kind of environment. And yet, when's the last time your organization put a work plan together around friendships? It doesn't happen. Which is why, again, we went out on the mission that we went out on. There are 3 areas, and this is where we're going to be talking about and actually giving you a bit of a roadmap on how you can be more successful in your coming year. And we're going to talk about 4 different areas today. We're going to talk about your careers, which is something I'm sure many of you are interested in. We're going to talk about your team implementation and team success as a team and you as a leader. We're going to talk about project management and the successful implementation of key technology engagements that you have in the coming year. And then ultimately, we're going to talk on behalf of these wonderful folks at Gartner about how do you utilize this event more effectively. Everything that I'm talking about is going to boil down to your capacity to more effectively manage relationships, your capacity to manage your connectivity with other people. We're going to start with the mindsets, and we're going to end with the process. The skill sets are things we won't have time for in the period of an hour or so that we have together. That's stuff that you can get online. There's a lot more of the tactics associated with this. I've got a whole YouTube channel that's free. You go to keithferrazzi.com. You can see a lot of this information. You can see it in the books that we've written and the work that we've done. But in terms of the process, I want to review with you today at least a subset of it and the mindsets which we're going to hit hard, because if I can get you to believe something differently today, then you're going to do something differently when you walk out of the door. If I can get you to do something differently at this event that makes you as an individual more effective at building relationships, raises and elevates your desire to have a more effective relationship action plan for your career, for your team, and for your projects, and I can get you excited about it here, I might get you to do something when you get back to the office. And my hurdle to success with you is not whether I'm good corporate entertainment. I really don't care. I'm here because I actually believe that we have a chance to make a difference in business. I really do believe we have a chance to make a difference in business, and this is a group that can lead that difference by showing how it's really done on some of the more difficult and risky things that an organization does. Big investments in big projects. Think about these 4 rules at the bottom. These are the rules that your teams should operate under. Number 1, of course, without results, we're done. That speaks the executive language. That has to do with the shareholder value. That has to do with meeting your budgets. You all know that, I'm pretty sure. The next step, say what you're thinking. Take a risk and say what you're thinking. If your team is not doing that, then you are absolutely at fault as an individual leader for not creating the kind of environment which will drive innovation, which will drive breakthrough change, and will reduce the cycle time of the changes you're trying to make. You need to have high degrees of candor. Give a damn enough to forgive. This has to do with empathy. Empathy is another word for trust, is another word for care, is another word for intimacy. All of these things, some of which get more squishy as I mention these words. We're going to come back to giving you a bit of a formula on how you as an individual can gather around you more care. I want you to leave this realizing that you can create more care aimed at you and your projects than you've ever had before, and that it's a choice. Now, I'm actually going to stop on that for a second, because this is probably one of the greatest breakdowns in large organizational change management and large human resource management. And that is that most of you and your peers don't believe that relationships and people stuff is actually a choice. Most of you believe that it's serendipitous and accidental and chemical. It either happens or it doesn't, right? If you think back to the great teams, the really solid teams that have been created that were powerful and important, you could probably find a few elements. And this is what we've done over the last 8 years. We've gone into those great teams and we asked what were some of the precipitating moments which transferred nothing more than a group of people working together into a cohesive team that wouldn't let each other fail, or in the words of our newest book, that really has each other's backs, right? Those kind of teams, usually you found some critical moment. I often say that the best thing you could do is you could orchestrate your entire team being stuck in an airport overnight, snowed in, with nothing but soda crackers and a box of Jack Daniels. Those things were happening, you know, getting drunk together, hanging out, and one of them, by the way, and I'll even add something that might seem a little bit bizarre, and add to the fact that one of the individuals on the team needs to get home because their father is ill, right? You throw that into the mix of that environment, and that team will bond in a way that will never be forgotten. That team will bond in a way that will create empathy, that will overcome terrible behavior that somebody has from procrastinating or another person has because they're so insecure that they treat people like jerks, right? That because what happens in that incident is you've actually accelerated relationship development and you didn't even know it. It got accelerated like that based on the grist of the mill. Does this make sense? Tell me you get it. Now what I'm saying to you is you don't have to wait for the grist of the mill. You can create your grist of the mill. You can create your accelerating relationship behaviors, and that's what we're going to talk about as we move forward to the next set of mindsets. And then the final issue is, once a decision has been made, not letting each other fail. That's a level of accountability, but also a level of generosity that's off the charts. And that's the kind of teams that you're going to need to shepherd the kind of changes that I know in the back of your head you think your organizations need to make, but you know damn well they're not ready to absorb. And unless you can create the environment that has all of those things playing together, you won't succeed. One of my very first projects, I ran the CRM practice at Deloitte years and years and years ago. And one of my very first projects was with a very large healthcare provider, right? And this was a large national healthcare provider, and we were doing, back then it wasn't called CRM, it was called Sales Process Reengineering. This is before Tom Siebel was a glimmer in anybody but his own eye, okay? And he still stays a glimmer in his own eye, but that's Tom if everyone knows him. The key back then was Sales Process Reengineering, right? And we were hired by the CIO to implement technologies. That's why I made the joke about the CRM system earlier. That were going to enable more effective selling, which was always odd because isn't it interesting? CRM has never actually gave a damn about selling process. All it is opportunity management. That's a whole separate discussion to have. But the CRM systems, at the time, we had all these great promises for what we were going to do. And in that situation, the head of marketing and the head of sales and the CIO hated each other. All right? And I should have been able to see from the very beginning of that project that that in and of itself was the death nail of a successful implementation of sales process automation and sales success. How many of you are in positions where you're trying to support technology enablement across divisions where people aren't playing like adults? Raise your hands. So this is our responsibility. Let's just get real. If we can't fix that, if we can't enable that, if we can't do something about that, your system implementation is somewhere close to doomed or at least to mediocrity, and guess who gets blamed for it? The people in this room. Does that make sense to you? Tell me you get it. All right, so let's talk about some of the facilitative mechanisms to go about doing that. First of all, you as a hub and spoke can be the enabling relationship at a minimum to all the key players that are behaving badly. Now, we're going to come back to what does it take to actually get somebody to behave less badly. But this is fundamentally the movement of any great relationship, right? And what I want to prove to you is that everybody in this room can strengthen, and maybe before we start, what I'm ultimately going to ask you to do is very simple. Imagine for a moment one of your most important career goals this year. Now, by the way, this could be you getting a promotion or getting some different job, or it just could be the successful implementation of a major project. Whatever it is, I want everybody in this room to think about 3 people who, if they were really on your side, if you really bonded with them in a way that you don't do today, whether they are a negative relationship today or a neutral one or just mediocre in nature, But I'm talking about, this is the kind of person that if in the future you walked into the room and you both exhaled, kicked up your shoes, and had a conversation that was real with them, right? Remember what those are like, to walk into somebody you're trying to serve and they actually care about you? When you said, listen, I know you want X, but do me a favor, just trust me. And they actually do, right? That's off the basis of a good relationship, often created over a long period of time in the grist of the mill, yada, yada. But imagine if there were 3 people that you'd like to have that kind of relationship with. And as I go through this next series of exercise, we're going to leave this presentation with you making some commitments to go build those 3 relationships that will make you more successful, after I give you some structure around how to do that. All right? So be thinking about those 3 people. Got that? Good. Now, around those 3 people, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to look around this room for a second at all these people in the room. Okay? Just do a quick exercise. Look around the people. You haven't met them yet, but what I want you to do very quickly is I want you to judge them. Again, you giggle, and why you giggle? Because you already did it. I just gave you permission. All right? And it's okay that you already did it, because that is a natural anthropological thing to do. You know, you're sitting there, you're looking at these people. Are they smart? Are they interesting? Are they fun? Am I going to be stuck with these people for the next, 3 days or whatever it is? Do they got big stick up their back end? Are they people that I wouldn't enjoy or would enjoy? That's what's going through your head. Really, fundamentally, what's going through your head is your reptilian brain is kicking into high gear, and it's saying, are these people safe? Are these people safe? That's what's going on in terms of chemically in your body, right? And you're coming up with lots of justifications for yes, for no, or whatever, but that's what's going on in your head. Now, let me change that for a second. How many of you have ever known somebody that you met originally, you prejudged who they were, and you were just wrong? Raise your hands. Of course, that's what I mean. Indicative of the fact that our prejudgment, our reptilian brain, fires off defensive signals that actually overreach what's necessary, right? Let me tell you who's in the room. There's a group, most of the people in this room are missing the fact that they're not home with their families. That's who's in this room. A lot of people in this room, there's a few people in this room that are really in love, like and have been for a long, long, long time. There are some people in this room who aren't, and fundamentally have resolved that they don't think they ever will be. There are people in this room who are themselves deeply concerned about their parents because their parents are deeply ill. There are people in this room who have their own illnesses that they're struggling with and concerned about personally. There are people in this room who are thrilled about their new grandchildren or children. There's people who are worried about their children if they're teenagers right now, right? That's who's in the room. That's who's in the room. And it's amazing if you now just sort of let that soak in for a second and look around the room for just a moment. Just look around the room for a moment. And imagine how your mind is firing off a set of signals that's slightly different than they were the last time you looked around the room. Does that make sense to you? All I've done is I've calmed your reptilian tribal brain to relax some of the negative prejudgments and project some of the potentially positive prejudgments. Now imagine if your team members, as they went out to gather users' requirements, imagine if they had the skills, the simple skills, not to be intimidated, not to prejudge, but to begin to project in advance some of the empathy that's necessary to actually bond with the people that they're interviewing for the projects that you're executing. Would that make a difference, yes or no? Yeah. That was not really a yes. Does that mean that there was a large no, or was that just a quiet yes? Just yes or no? Yes. Okay, right. But look how easy that was for that coaching to have been done just right now, right? But do we ever think about that? How many of you have ever had such a bad relationship with a user, but through lots of other reasons, when I say a user, a client, internal customer, but through lots of reasons, you ended up making them some of your best friends? Has that ever happened to you? Raise your hands. So the next time you've got that difficult person that's stopping you from implementing a system, I want you to paste the face of that other individual that you transformed into a positive relationship onto that individual and begin to project what it could be by you making a conscious effort to build that positive relationship. The positive psychology of you as an individual determining in advance that a relationship can be a choice is transformative to all of us, and that's the prejudgment. Now, I haven't yet proven to you or made you do anything. I've just made you say, that's interesting. So that's fine. Let's start there. The next level up of proving to you that this is possible eventually will be getting you to experience it. But in the short term, it's now thinking about a slightly other idea. Think about for a second when somebody shares something that is deeply passionate to them as an individual. Deeply passionate to them as it, what lights them up. What lights you up for a second? Just think about that for a second. What lights you up? What really lights you up as an individual? Family, maybe it's your job, maybe it's some great accomplishment, maybe it's a nonprofit organization. What lights you up? What's interesting about the question of what lights you up is that it begins to transform who you are when you talk about it. Think about that for a second. When you talk about what lights you up, what happens is there's serotonin that gets released in a positive way because you're reflecting back on a moment or time when you were intimate, loving, excited, playing golf, whatever it happens to be. You go back to a place and it actually chemically starts setting off some chemicals that transforms who you are, and you become a more contagiously positive person to be around when you're talking about the stuff that lights you up. And it's better when you can get somebody to actually tell a story about it, not just say it. Not just my kids. Who cares? But let me tell you about Johnny as Johnny stepped up and went to bat at Little League and what that did for me, because I was so excited to see him connecting with other people, and he didn't do well, but it was okay because his teammates were there for him. All of a sudden it transforms the engagement. Stories are emotional transportation. When you're doing requirements identification, what you really need to be doing is asking people to tell you stories about where they want to be as a result of this system. Don't ask them for bullet points. Ask them to tell you a story associated with what life is going to be like once they've actually gotten to the stage where the system is enabling them to be or do whatever they want to be or do, right? Because that's when you'll start to really uncover the requirements. And more importantly, through their storytelling, whether it's of their own passions and excitement, or whether it's through their hopes and aspirations for the future, their dreams for themselves and their careers, that's where they will begin to show up in ways that will enlist you as the change agent. Does all that make sense? Okay. Now, ultimately, the kind of connectivity that we all need, the kind that's loyal, the kind that won't let you fail, the kind that has your back, that kind of connectivity requires something that most of you in this room really don't want to go to, and it's called vulnerability. It's not until you're vulnerable that you're able to emotionally connect ultimately with another individual. There's been way more research than we've ever done or could ever collect on that precipitating moment, which is it's through vulnerability that you connect with another person. How many of you have ever wanted to get to know someone, but you just couldn't connect with that person? You wanted to get through, but they had a wall around them, you couldn't get through. Raise your hands if you know what I'm talking about. Right? How many of you married to that person? Anybody used to be married to that person? The key is you are that person. We all are. But what fundamentally makes any of us behave badly? Insecurities. Our own insecurities tend to be the precipitating mechanism that create the walls, the forcing mechanisms, etc. around us. They're just protective mechanisms. That's all they are. They're human psychology protective mechanisms. It's where some of us go inward, others of us go out, some of us get mean, some of us get angry, some of us get whatever. Those are all protective mechanisms to the human psyche that the psychology, the reptilian brain is firing off and keeping you protected, right? Now, with all of that in mind, the key is to figure out how not to be that and how to enable more effective understanding of others and to get them to not trigger their defensive mechanisms as quickly. And the way you lead with that is your own vulnerability. Your vulnerability will actually be the key to your success. Now, I'm not talking about walking in and going to a brand new CEO at the first day of the job and saying, let me tell you how vulnerable I am. What I'm talking about is your willingness to ultimately have your guards down enough to be truthful and transparent. Let me give you a little bit of a background. I grew up in Pittsburgh. My papa's a steel worker. My mom was a cleaning lady. And they made a strong commitment early on to make sure, and we were an immigrant Italian family, to make sure that their kid had a good education. They got me into a school. Probably when you were growing up, did you go to Central Catholic or Greensburg High?
I moved to Cleveland when I was little.
Okay. So you're at Shaker or Chagrin? Euclid. I was just wondering if you're one of the rich guys or not. Okay. So back in Greensburg, the school that I went to was a school that was created for the Mellon children, literally created for the Mellon children. And it was on the Mellon estate. It was the private schooling system for the Mellons. There were only 8 kids in the school, and we'd come, and it was on their home estate, and you know the recreational stuff was Rolling Rock Country Club. I thought all kids learn how to do steeplechase racing. I guess not. I mean, this is the kind of life, and we would come driving up in a beat-up green Nova with rust spots, and the other kids would have chauffeur-driven cars, etc. You know, my mom was a cleaning lady for many of their houses. I used to work at the country club where they would, you know, my peers would play for, you know, for the summer. Now that was an interesting way to grow up, and it was more interesting because kids are kids. They're mean at times, and they don't really think about it. But school uniform, for instance, we'd have to go down to Pittsburgh, and we would buy at Brooks Brothers, which is the great clothing store back then. I wouldn't wear the stuff now, but back then it was a big deal. And I'd be trying on those green blazers knowing I could never afford them. And I always wished someday I could afford it, because where I had to shop was Mom would go down to the local Salvation Army, where the older kids would have dropped off their green blazers after they'd worn them for 2 years. And that's where we shopped, and we put patches on the elbows. And I used to hate that, because not just the clothes were hand-me-downs, that was less important. But going into the store, I was always so afraid that one of my classmates would come in dropping off clothes, right? And they would. And finally, in 5th grade, I got caught. I'm standing there, trying on the jacket in the aisle, and one of the girls came in from class, and she saw me. And I don't know if she saw me or she saw me after I saw her, and then I dove into the clothes rack and knocked it over, but she saw me, and she didn't say anything till the next day, where she came into the class, and she pushed me down, and she grabbed my jacket off of me. And by the way, she was a bigger girl. Just point that out. So you guys aren't judging me there. And she showed everybody that somebody else's name was written in the back of my jacket. Crushed me. What it did for me is it gave me a drive and ambition that was off the charts. I was never going to feel like that again. I was going to work harder. I was going to be faster. I was going to study more. I was never going to feel like that. I was going to go back someday, join that stupid country club. By the way, her name was Connie Semler. Just put that out to you. She's doing fine. I talked to her recently when day after I mentioned her name on CNBC. So what was interesting, though, is at the period of time, I made a commitment to myself that I was never going to feel like that again. Flip side is I didn't feel like I deserved to be in that room. I then went on to have a great education. I went to Yale. I went to Harvard Business School. Sitting there, I did not think I deserved to be in those rooms. When I got named partner, when I was less than 30 at Deloitte, and I got promoted, I got bumped into overhead prematurely as CMO there. I did not feel I deserved to be in that boardroom. Same at Starwood. Now, I masked it pretty well, because there was something my father used to tell me that would always give me the courage to put myself out there and to utilize everything and every opportunity that I had, but I didn't feel in my core. Now, as a leader, that really screwed me up, because my level of scarcity and panic was high. Little tiny things would go wrong, and I would instantly feel that there's no safety net. And even when I was successful, I would fear that I couldn't pay the rent. I mean, I would all of a sudden see 5 dominoes tip after the one little domino tipped, and I'd see all these things, and the next thing you know, the house of cards would fall down around me, and that's where my instincts would take me, right? That's where my insecurity would kick into behaviors that didn't make me the best leader that I needed to be. And that as an individual still exists, despite the fact that I can finally talk about it. And more importantly, when it does exist, here's the key. I've got a team that can call me on it. Jordan here. Jordan, just stand and wave. Jordan works with me. She runs my speaking business. And you can ask her. She's got permission, as does the woman who runs logistics and stuff, that when I'm traveling between 5 cities and I start to get panicked because all of a sudden the flight that you've got me on is only have a 30-minute connection to get to here, and I'm afraid that I'm going to show up, I'm going to piss off my client, and the next thing you know, I won't get hired for the next thing, is spinning around in my head. They're like, Keith, relax. You're acting like a scarcity maniac again. We get it. We understand. It's okay. We've talked to the client. We've got your back, right? They've got permission to do that, and I've got to tell you, if your people don't have the kind of permission to call you on the behaviors that hold you back as an individual, then you're being a cowardice leader. The worst leaders in the world are ones that pretend they have no faults. Because that just sends a message to all your people to cover their ass and pretend they have no faults. And it sends the message to everybody in your organization to make sure that all of you collectively pretend like you have no faults, and there's no growth going on in your team, there's no truth-telling, and you stumble around each other's issues before you would just really get on with it, right? I mean, imagine if you had the kind of candor and transparency that you could set as a tone at the top. I don't care if your CEO has that tone. I don't care if your peers have that tone. You can be the shining example of a culture that in your projects, your implementation, and your team looks to for success, but you've got to start with having the kind of courage that tells the truth. And then the kind of courage to realize that everybody's human, and all we are ultimately looking for is to find a place where we can be tribal and connect again. You can be that tribal leader, but it starts with you. Do you create, now I think this is really the summary of the whole talk, do you create an environment around yourself that invites people in to want to have a better relationship with you? Do you create an environment around yourself that invites people to be candid with you and tell you the truth? Do you create an environment around yourself that makes people want you to be a success? It makes people work double hard to not let you fail? Do you create an environment around yourself where your whole team cares enough about each other to not let each other fail? That is your capability. Now, by the way, if that isn't you and it wasn't me, then you say to your team, I want to be that leader. I want to be that leader, but I need your help to get me there. Here are the things that, and the first thing you could say is, here are some of the things that I do, but you tell me what I do. And actually be the person that has enough courage to want to hear the truth from your team. 360-degree review processes are a good start, but they're cowardice. You should be doing those every day. You should have the kind of culture that has a 360 every day around the most critical elements of your success and your team's success. We just recently looked, the annual review process is equally as broken and stupid. The annual review process is the process that says once a year you actually get to hear the truth. Well, we studied a number of companies where we looked at the information that's gathered about you as an individual, the honest, candid information, and then we looked at what's actually communicated to you, and we see that somebody sat down in front of you, looked at a bunch of candid information, and watered it all down because they were cowards. Now, what if you were the one that actively solicited all that candid feedback from all of your peers, up and down and sideways, and all of the users in the community of people that you're of service to, way in advance? And they knew that you were collecting this information because you wanted to be better. They knew that you wanted to hear the truth, and they knew that your ultimately objective was to be generous and serve them more effectively, which is why you were employing them to tell you the truth. If you did that 6 months ago, by the time you got to your review, guess what? There'd be no surprises. You'd have fixed the stuff that you needed to fix. Your review would be higher. Your bonus would be higher. And the organization would see you as the leader that you ultimately long to be on paper, but you're not acting like today. If you had that courage. And what you need to do is you need to find a few individuals, and that's what Who's Got Your Back talks about. You need the practice to find the courage to be that kind of tribe. And you maybe aren't going to walk in and do that to your team today because they might not have your back today. You might not walk in and do that to your community of users today because they might not have your back today. And you might not walk in and talk to your CEO today, but you need to find somebody that you can begin to practice being the kind of human that we're talking about here. The kind of leader with the kind of courage that we're talking about here. And if you don't find one or two or three people, 50% of Americans say that nobody has their back. 60% of the people who say nobody has their back are married. So you got to find somebody out there that you can practice with, having the kind of transparent relationship which will make you the kind of leader that you need to be. And maybe that's an old friend or an old buddy or a compadre or somebody from an old firm, whatever it is. Let me pause for a second. I've just shared with you a lot of my own personal struggle and some of the background. Think about the character called this speaker named Keith, who came out here at the beginning. And think about that character now that he's got a little bit more of transparency associated with his background. Think about those two individuals. What's true of that second individual different than what's true of that first? What do you think about me now? What do you think about that character now? Any idea, any comments? I'm sorry, what's that? More human. More human. So I'm assuming what you mean by that is more connected, more connectable. Any others? Oh, that's interesting. More credibility. Because I just talked about how really screwed up I am, and I'm now more credible. Isn't that interesting? Okay, what else? What's that? More investment. So let me phrase that. If I needed your help, would you be more or less likely to help me now? More. Isn't that interesting? So if I needed, you'd trust me more or less now? More or less? More. Respect, more or less? Now, it's interesting because when I say to you, this is the kind of behavior that I need you to let your guard down more, I need you to connect more, I need you to reach out more, everybody's instant instinct is, no, if I do that, people will hurt me. They won't respect me if I talk about that kind of stuff. And yet, we've just exhibited a taste of a relationship that began to transform based on a set of behaviors that you would have been concerned would have created a whole different set of outcomes, but in fact they didn't. They created a positive set of outcomes. So I just wanted you to internalize that for a little bit for yourself. But now ultimately our instructional design and what we do when we work with teams is you got to intellectually get it, but then you got to taste it a little bit, which you've done, but then you got to experience it before you can really make any transformation occur to yourself. So with that in mind, you're going to now organize into small groups of 3. And in those small groups of 3 at your table, and literally no more than 3 because we won't have time, we're only going to do 6-minute here, and then we're going to wrap up with some stuff. In small groups of 3, this guy's like, you're not making me do this. I get it. So in small groups of 3, I want you to be cut as quick as you can to the question, what holds you back? What holds you back as an individual? BK, you don't have to share it right now, but do you have some ideas of the things that you do that hold you back and limit you in some way in your professional life? You don't have to have a big thing, right? I talked about lots of stuff. And by the way, I'll even give you a tip. You guys can keep all these lights on. These are some of the things we see. We see victims who feel that other people do stuff to them. We feel strugglers like me who, if I'm not struggling, I tend to create my own stuff so that I continue to struggle because that's a very familiar behavior that makes me feel comfortable. Conflict avoiders. Overachievers. There are underachievers, probably not as many in this room, but overachievers who are never happy with your success. There are shamers who deliver feedback in a shaming fashion. There are fixers, control freaks in that regard who don't let anybody fail forwards. Bullies. Schmoozers who reach out to the world with, passing out business cards with one hand and a martini glass in the other, and you never really get to know who they are or connect with them. Micromanagers, jesters, always have a joke. Scientists, the analytical quotient we understand, but the emotional quotient isn't something I'm going to deal with. The pleasers, the dramatists. And look, these are just names that we have fun with naming because they're fun because they're just human behaviors that are no big deal. They really are. There's stuff we do that triggered in subconscious behaviors in the back of your head that you don't even have control over. And they're actually addictions because many of us practice these things even though we know we do them. We keep doing them anyway. And we won't stop even though we know they don't serve us well. Just like alcohol or cigarettes or sex or other things can be an addiction, so can these things, behavioral addictions. What we do is when we're looking at changing behavioral addictions, what we realize is you can't solve these yourself. Just like a drunk can't get sober easily by themselves. One day at a time, they've got to show up to peer-to-peer accountability and peer-to-peer pressure in the 12-step program of AA. You need to show up with your teams in a peer-to-peer fashion, saying, these are the things that are doing that hold me back, and let's work on this stuff together. When you see me doing it, I want you to kick me in the butt and tell me I'm doing it. Because real teams have that capacity to have that kind of transparency and support if you've got the courage and the social comfort underneath. What do you do that holds you back? You don't have to find one of these. Just tell a story. It doesn't matter. You don't have to know where it came from. You just have to know that you tend to do some stuff that holds you back. You ready? 6 minutes, 3 people, go have that conversation. All right, come on back. So, look, let's just spend just a second and ask, what was that experience? What did you experience sharing what you were just sharing? You don't have to. I don't want to hear what you shared, but what I want to hear is, what did you observe? What did you observe about that experience that you just went through? Any thoughts? Okay, you experienced vulnerability. So to some of you, it might have even been very difficult exercise, particularly at the beginning, right? What else did you experience? Yes, sir. You were alike in a lot of ways. How many of you in this room found that whatever you were sharing or other people were sharing, you shared it? I mean, it was the same thing that you had experienced yourselves. Raise your hands. Oh, that's interesting. So that's almost all of you. Here's what you need to learn. Get over yourselves. You're not unique. But really what you need to learn is that the stuff that we wouldn't normally share with others, that fundamentally we're a little bit embarrassed by, vulnerable of, the stuff that is really dry, is the same stuff that we as humans just deal with. It's human. That's why I said at the beginning, if we could only get to the stage when we'd realize that this stuff isn't to be shied away from, and you're not a pariah, and you're not weak, and it's not negative. It just is, right? It's universal. And if we could understand it as universal, our empathy levels are higher, our willingness to forgive is significantly increased, and we begin to work this into our systems in ways that just make sense. It's just stuff. You know, you can't get around this messy stuff, and trying to yields you in a place of conflict, avoidance, and ignorance of factors that will just tank you. That will just tank you. Any other observations? Any of you found that the person that you were talking to, as they shared more, you cared about them more? Don't raise your hands. Because I'm just afraid that you're traumatized the person, because you're like, nope, not me. Not really. I thought he was a big loser. Just look, I mean, the answer is, of course you do. That's also part of human nature. We even find in monkeys that other people's vulnerability makes you connect. It really does, in positive ways. Look, I'm not saying that there aren't people in your institution that are political jackasses that are looking to one-up and that have a grudge against you or a grudge against themselves or whatever it is, and they're not going to try to use information in negative ways. I'm not saying that all of that isn't something that exists, right? But I am saying that a lot of your sense of that is your own insecurity that you're throwing up, preventing you from having the kind of connectivity that you need to be successful. And if you're going to let that individual be the individual that stops you from creating an environment around yourself that makes you successful, then you're letting that individual stop you from succeeding and stop the organization from succeeding. If you're the individual that says, Keith, I couldn't find 3 people that have my back inside the company. If that's true, then I promise you, you're the problem. It is. There's no way that it could be possible that there aren't 3 people in the organization that with enough sufficient relationship sensitivity on your part, enough proactive ability to create the safety around you that invites them in, that you can't get to the stage where you've got real partners in life and in business again. That is your insecurity and your walls that are being thrown up that are stopping you from being the success you deserve to be. I want to walk through some process steps real quick to make sure we got it. The goals that you have in the year need to be targeted against a group of individuals. It's interesting, I was listening to the gentleman who was giving a great presentation before me, and what I happen to think about, though, is with all of the project management planning you're doing, there's one big question, not where I'm going to go, how I'm going to get there, the metrics, etc. There's one question that was missing, that's missing in almost every project and strategic plan that exists. It's a simple question, who? Who? Who are the people critical and the relationships, and are we good? And it's interesting, you go back to our CRM systems. I'll give you a real screwed up one. There is no metric inside of an individual's name in a field inside of a CRM system that measures the relationship strength of an individual to an individual inside of your company. If you look about strategic relationship indices, it's company to company. There is no such thing as a relationship to a company. It's person to person. We're working right now with folks like Salesforce.com and Accenture and other systems that now have to catch up to what we're training Salesforces. We're training Salesforce to go build better relationships with people, and the systems don't enable or support it. I mean, just think about that. Just think about the 3 names that I asked you to think about earlier. 3 names. Write down those 3 names of the people that you want to have a better relationship with for the coming year. Write those names down. Next to each of those names, I want you to give it a intimacy metric. Quantify the intimacy, and I'll give you what that means. From a -1, which means it's a damaged relationship, I don't care how damaged it is, it's -1. 0, I don't know them. Not really relevant, I would assume, in this situation for you, because you probably know all of those 3 individuals. A 1 is someone we're barely aware of each other. That could be true if you're a global CIO and you've got somebody who's a critical player in a foreign market and you really don't know them at all. They barely aware of you. You might be new to the organization. A 2 is what I call a transactional relationship. You sit in meetings with them. You have transactions with them only. A 3 is an acquaintance. We often call them friends at work, but they're not. They're acquaintances. If they were a friend, you'd know who they were. You'd know something about them. You'd care about their dreams. You'd know their significant others. That would be a 4. That's a friend. And you do have their cell phone. And you do call them on the weekends because you like to, not because you have to. Right? A 5 is a lifeline. This is your individuals that if you needed to, you could call at midnight for your own personal issues. So -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Write down what that strength of relationship is with those 3 individuals. This is a very simple tool, if you think about it, you should be doing for all 25 of the most important relationship maps you would do for your key projects and initiatives. I say 25 to start with because we've not yet seen a major project implementation. We can get in project mapping. In fact, we do this. We work for some of the companies, vendors who are calling on you, some of the big the big 6 and the consulting firms. We work on them to do relationship strategic account mapping against you and your organization. So we're working with them to figure out whether or not their critical account guy calling on you has a relationship that's a 3, 4, or a 5, or a 2, or a -1. Oddly enough, most of your vendors who are critical to the success of these projects, you have relationships with them that are somewhere down at the level of 1 or 2. They're somewhere down at the level of 1 or 2, and these are critical players that are integrated to the success of your projects. All this stuff needs to be fixed. So you target these individuals. The next thing you need to do is you need to define what you can do to make them more successful. So you got 3 people there. What can you do to make them more successful? What can you do to make them more successful? What we have found is that with all great relationships, you've got to lead with generosity. If this is a regional individual or this is the head of sales, right? And you're putting in a new CRM system. Well, you need to make sure that head of sales knows that you're busting your butt to make them successful, including when they're not around, they better know that you're bragging about them to the executive that you work for, right? Because they need to see you as their advocate and their ambassador, because ultimately what they care about is not your qualifications as an individual CIO. What they care is about these things relative to their life. They care about their professional growth. And if you can help their careers, then you're a winner, and they'll work with you. Financial success in your world is tied to professional growth. They care about their own deep relationships. If you don't know that they're going through a divorce and they're a critical user of yours, and their life is being turned upside down as a result of their own personal life, or their kid is going through a particular tough time, you're telling me that one of the most important people on your team, and if you don't understand what's going on in their personal lives, that's just not your business? You don't think that impacts their ability to perform? Of course it does, right? And if you don't have at least 3-level relationship with this person, you have no permission to learn anything about their personal lives. Ultimately, they care about their intellectual stimulation. Your best friends in work are the kind of people you sit around and you shoot the stuff with, and you talk about, interesting ideas and things. They care about their physical wellness. Mike Milken once told me, health, wealth, and children are the 3 things that fundamentally build loyalty in all great relationships. Health, wealth, and children. Health. They care about their physical wellness. They care about giving back. They care about being grounded, spirituality. And just remember, the empathy goes beyond user requirements identification. If you're really going to build a level 3, 4, or 5-level relationship with somebody, it goes beyond the transactional, which doesn't differentiate you nor your relationships, doesn't make them loyal, and doesn't make anybody care about your success. and doesn't give you any permission to say, trust me on this one. All right? I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying you can snap your finger and make all 3 of those people level 5 level relationships. I'm not saying you'll get to level 3 or 4 with some of them. But I can say that if you intentionally choose to move a relationship a little bit forward, you will. You will. And if you measure it and monitor it. You got to learn and have a little bit of success in sparring. Start teaching your team that feedback is a gift, and it starts with you. Start teaching your team about greater levels of transparency and candor of information, and that you will all sink if you don't have this. And you got to start by being the individual that's willing to take it, the truth-telling, in order to be able to give it fluidly so that it doesn't feel punitive. Make people feel safe. When you're giving feedback, you got to make them feel safe. And when you're receiving feedback, make them feel safe. How do I make them feel safe? When I say to Jordan, Jordan, you got to tell me if I'm doing anything that stops me from being successful. You know my dreams. You know my mission. You know that I don't, that I want you to perform at your peak. You need to tell me what I need to do that makes you successful. And I'll bend over backwards to do it, and I won't always be there. And if I'm spinning out of my head, out of control, and worried about my own success for a moment, then I need you to bring me back, right? Because this is good for the both of us. That's how you make somebody feel safe to give you feedback. Does that make sense to you? All right. And when people give it to you, you don't debate it. You just say thank you, knowing that you're in full control of all data and feedback that's been given to you, particularly from your people. Jordan says to me, Keith, you really ought to wear those big pink fluffy shoes that I've been giving you. That's really what you ought to. I'm like, thank you, Jordan. I appreciate that. I don't have to take somebody else's advice. I just have to make sure that I create the fluid information that I'll always get her advice. I don't have to agree with it. I shouldn't be intimidated to take it, to hear it, because I have the ultimate control of it. The basic system is you need to start practicing for each of you as an individual. Now, this is now at the individual level. Who's Got Your Back teaches you how to build the kind of lifeline relationships that you need to practice being tribal, right? This is the kind of individual that you need to find a group of people that really you can connect with inside your company, outside your company, and say, listen, where do I want to be in the next 3 to 5 years? What are the things that I need to be doing? You got to learn how to fight in healthy ways. It's been interesting. I've learned in my lifeline groups how to fight. I've taken that home to my personal relationships because I've gained more courage trusting my instincts in safe places, and then you bring them to unsafe places. I have one particular client who finally said to me, Keith, I get it. We've been doing this now. We've cascaded it through the company, but I could never do this at home because my wife would use this against me. I'm still working on him. But the point is that you need a safe place to practice. The reason why we don't take this to the most vulnerable relationships, the most important ones, is because we're fearful of damaging them. It's why in the other situation, it's why bartenders get an earful, right? They're safe. Be the safe environment to have those kind of organizations. You commit collectively to improvement. I'm going to give you a little bit of a system. This is a system that we use that you can begin to use immediately. Number one, you need to focus with your team on team cohesion. Make your team a level 3, 4, and 5 level team. Nobody in your team should have anything less than a level 3 level relationship. You've got to move everybody at your core team, the people that report to you, and the people that are of the project teams quickly have to be levels 2, 3, and 4. I'm sorry, 3, 4, and 5, right? Now, there's lots of ways to do that. On a monthly basis, going out and having a great dinner together over a lot of red wine and talking about what's really going on in your lives is a way. Culturally enigma to some of you, perhaps, so find other ways. But you've got to find ways to create that safe environment among a group of individuals that gives the team cohesion and team commitment component that's personal and empathetic in nature. Number 2, start teaching collaborative problem solving. Teach it. That means teach feedback. That means teach candor. Give people taste of what it's like to tell the truth in a meeting. And the way you do that is a very simple way. You get a group of people, and our methodology is simple. You can't do it as the group as a whole because the environment, if you haven't created already, isn't there. Break your group into small subgroups of 4 to go away and take a tough problem and come back and report. What happens when that happens? In small groups of 4, they tell more truth than they would in the big group, right? They get more candid, they take more risks. Then the peer-to-peer support, when they come back to the team, forces them to tell more candor in the group. because they don't want to look like they were cowards by having truth-telling in the small group and not having the ability to tell truth in the big group. So it's just a very simple little exercise, but there's lots of other things you need to be able to do. This is actually, I think this is pretty much detailed in, actually, if you're interested in, there's a Lifeline group kit that normally is a sold product. We'll send it to you if you want for free. Either send us an email online and note this talk, or give your card to Jordan or something. We can send you the Lifeline group kit. But the point is that you need to be able to have some practice in this collaborative problem-solving piece. The next piece is you need to begin the relationship action plan. You need to begin the relationship action plan. As you think about your initiatives, even your team, forget about a major initiative, just your team, right? Your team's about to just being successful this year for all the things you need to do. Who are the 25 people that your team has to have better relationships with in order for you and your team to be successful and glowing this year? And then you align your 10 people, 8 people, 12 people against each of those 25, because relationships are built people to people. You don't have to have all 25 relationships. One of your team members can have a strong relationship with somebody else that actually solidifies that. You then need to begin to state to your team that we're all going to grow together. Make a commitment to continuous improvement among your group. And ask what you all need to learn, what you need to do to grow. What are the things that each of you do that hold you back? Become a support group for each other in being more successful professionals. Finally, make sure that you take this out to the people you serve. You become the beacons that take this philosophy out to your organizations. You become the leaders of change management. You become the leaders of culture. If you actually, is there anybody in this room that would believe that if you actually implemented a system similar to this in your own way, in your own fashion, that you wouldn't transform the way you serve others? If you did this and you served others so well, people are going to be coming to you to how you did it. The CMO is going to be asking you how you got everybody in the executive team to have your back. You could become the beacons of success. You started the conference with a bunch of stuff. What do you want to try to do? And I think actually after this talk, you could probably all go home. Number one, how do I prove the business value of IT? No one's going to listen to you about the business value of IT or trust what you have to say if they don't have a personal relationship enough to be able to suspend their disbelief or prejudices about all this money you're spending unless they have a personal relationship with you. How can we use IT to drive growth and innovation? It's going to be by changing the relationships that actually increase the kind of growth and innovation in your people that will transform the growth and the innovation of the company. How will I meet rising expectations with fewer resources? By getting more out of the people that you have. Stop trying to be the bottleneck of 70% of the communication up to you and unleash the team to be there for each other. What opportunities and threats am I missing? You won't hear them if you haven't created the kind of environment around you that allows truth to occur. How do I build my executive team? You build it as a lifeline group that won't let each other fail. That's how. And you extend that to the executive team that you're a part of with the CEO. How can I make a tangible impact on the businesses? It's all about results. It's all about results. And you're never going to lose face of the fact that this is about accountability and results. And how should I lead during tough times? During the toughest times, it's the people that matter. It's the people that matter. This is my pop, and I'll end with this story. When I was 8 years old, this actually was a couple of years before my pop died, but when I was 8 years old, my dad had been unemployed for 6 months. And back then, he worked at Kennametal. I don't know if you knew the company. Back then, if you were unemployed for 6 months, you were hired back. If you were hired back, you were hired back as a new man. You lost all your pension. So the Christmas that this had all happened, it was November. And Dad knew that if he was going to be hired back, we would have no money. We had no, when my dad died, by the way, I was a new kid at Deloitte. We had $5,000 life insurance policy to bury him with. We had no pension and no savings. And I couldn't even afford to pay for the funeral. And it was the CEO of Deloitte Consulting at the time that paid for my dad's funeral. I know for a fact that strong relationships are critical to the success in an organization. And by the way, that was the same individual that made sure that I was the one that was promoted earlier and prematurely, frankly, into a CMO job. It wasn't about being the brightest guy in the thing. It was about loyalty. It was about commitment to people and a team. But you go back to this era where Dad and I where I was just young. I was 8. And we did everything on Sunday. By the way, when I was a kid, I didn't have a name. My dad's name was Pete, and all everybody called me was Repeat. Because everywhere my father went, he took me. And on Saturdays, it was always our rounds day. We would go around to all of his friends, and he would show me off, basically. And at the end of the rounds, we'd stop at Delillo's Food Market in Jeanette, and we'd get a chunk of pepperoni and a fresh baked loaf of Italian bread. And on our way home, Dad would stop along the side of the road. He'd tell me stories. Mostly because Mom would never let us eat that crap at home, but it's... So we're sitting there, and up along the side of the road, this was right across the street from the Latrobe Country Club, about 3 miles from our home. Right along the side of the road, there was a pile of trash, and in that pile of trash, there was a big wheel. You know what that is, like a 3-wheel plastic toy thing? And that big wheel was something my dad knew that I had wanted, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to afford much on the Christmas front. So he gets up out of his car. What do you think it takes for a 55-year-old proud steelworker to go grab a piece of toy for his son in a trash bin while his son's still in the car? It actually gets worse because his son, afraid that one of his snooty friends would go by, was hiding in the back of the car embarrassed. Didn't bother my father. I don't know if it bothered him, probably bothered him, but he wasn't going to let his son not have that. He wasn't going to fend for his family in whatever way he could. He goes over, he picks up the big wheel, and he brings it not back into the car, but brings it up the sidewalk because he's sitting there in the back of his head. He wants to teach his son something that he always wanted to reinforce, which was this message. Don't ever be afraid to ask. The worst anyone could ever say is no. He wasn't just going to take it. He was going to ask for it in front of the lady to make sure that that message was ingrained. That's not the message, by the way, that I want to leave you with, because something much more powerful was something I learned that day from the woman who came to the door. She comes to the door, and she's gesturing with her hands, because we're all Italian back there. And she's saying, of course you can keep the big wheel. She says, wait a second. She goes into the garage, and she pulls out a bicycle. And that bicycle is something that prompted me to say, screw Connie Semler, I don't care. I'm up out of the car. I'm walking up the sidewalk to see this thing that I think is about to be mine, which I'm very excited about. She sees me, and she goes back into the garage. And she pulls up the garage door, and she says, sir, maybe this is too much, but my grandkids have moved away, and we were redding up, as we say in Pittsburgh, redding up the garage, and we've got a lot of stuff we didn't have the heart to throw away. Can I give your son this mechanical go-kart for Christmas? For me, it was like cha-ching, you know. I still the picture of me with like the big helmet, and my dad had to wrap you know, mechanical tape and a block of wood on the gas pedal, and I was running around on it. The lesson here is more important, because this very day I go home and I see my mom, and I stop by that old gray Victorian house, and I usually spend that time remembering what I really need to remember, because it's tough for me. I talk to my pop a little bit, and I think about how that woman must have felt on Christmas Eve. Think about that for a second. You're this lady, you're doing the dishes, maybe you're going to tuck the kids away, you're wrapping some gifts if they're home or whatever. Who got the greater gift that Christmas? Who was she thinking? She's thinking about that kid that she helped, that family that she helped. Who got the greater gift that Christmas? She did. No question. And that's what I need to remember. Because there are people in my life that want to help me, and I don't let them. There are people in your lives that are waiting for you to allow them to help, and you don't let them. Some of them may be very intimate friends. Some of them may be your significant others. There are people in your team who look up to you and would love to have a relationship with you and a mentorship and a sense of team and tribalism and connectedness, and your guards are up in ways that hasn't invited that in. There are people you haven't even met yet in the world that if you just took this idea of walking around the world and creating an environment around yourself and realizing the relationships are the key to both your and other people's success, and that connectedness can transform your and their lives, that this could be powerful. This event could be fundamentally different is if all of you stopped walking around trying to figure out what you came to get out of this event. And what if you all walked around and thought, or just asked the question, how can I help you? At the cocktail event you're about to have, literally, what if you walk up to each other and use it as a joke? It's okay. It's an icebreaker. How can I help you? You know, what did you come here to learn? Who did you come here to meet? What are you trying to figure out that I can be helpful to you on? How can I help you? Because if you walk around the world asking, how can I help you, and put your chest out that way, you're going to be more courageous. You're not going to be skulking around networking in a way that makes you feel like afterward you got to go get a shower. You're going to be walking around trying to be the kind of people that you long to be, connected individuals. How can I help you? Be a host. What if every one of you was a host at this event going forward? What do hosts do? They make everybody else comfortable and grounded and successful. Be that in life. And at the pinnacle of that, recognize that the greatest generosity you will give anybody in your life, if they already care about you, is their ability to help you too. So let that happen. Good luck.